This is the first of a breakout session on education entitled The Crisis: How Does Public Education Survive and Thrive? I'm John Britton, as I said, substituting for John Pierre as the moderator because John had to go help save his Southern Law Center at Southern University in Baton Rouge from budget cuts. So he couldn't be here with us today. These education panels were largely developed by the conference coordinators for the Mississippi Freedom Summer 50th anniversary by Bob Moses and Dave Dennis. Dave Dennis also expresses his regrets that he couldn't be here today either, but he's on a Freedom Summer work-related trip to the Delta today with Marion Wright Edelman, another veteran lawyer of 1964 here in Mississippi, to open up some Children's Defense Fund freedom schools in certain places in the Delta. However, we do have Bob Moses here, and I would ask at this time, yes, the brother deserves all of the efforts back then, as well as his continuing efforts now in education, largely through his algebra project and other related educational programs. Bob, would you please come up? And would you kindly just set the stage in terms of what you envision in this first panel on the crisis in education, as well as the panel that follows in this same room on higher education, and particularly your goal of not only dissecting the past 50 years, but what you would like to see in going forward in terms of an action plan. Bob Moses.
How's everybody? So here's the thing. What we have planned is on today, tomorrow, and Friday, from roughly this time through 6, discussions about issues dealing with education, public school education in our country. What we want is out of these discussions, not just people who come and listen, we really would like people who want to sit through and begin to talk about strategies, how to move forward. So at the end of every set of sessions on a given day, we will be having people who want to continue this conversation and think about what the next steps are. That's what we'd like to get out of this. So true, there are people here who are coming to hear for the first time about these issues, but there are also people who've been working on them for a long time. And we would like to see if we can begin to get a conversation, figure out what are the questions that we need to be addressing and how we need to address them. So thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you, Bob. All of your continued service. Over the next roughly 90 minutes, we will proceed as follows. A brief introduction by our panelists for no more than 4 minutes. I will keep time. And then a presentation by each of the panelists on about a half dozen subjects related to the crisis, such as the continuing segregated and unequal education, the promises of Brown, how to change the paradigm from the achievement gap, the high dropout rates, the low graduation rates, the low college matriculation rates for children of color and low-income children, Add on to that the cutoff, to use the continuing metaphor, or the shutdown of the school-to-prison pipeline, the increase in funding for all of those challenges above, and some of the newer current dimensions around high-stakes testing, teacher evaluation based upon testing, and also the privatization of education through vouchers and through charter schools. And then we will leave approximately 30 minutes for those of you who would like to ask questions in the audience about where we go from here in terms of freedom and equality in education. To begin very briefly, I'm John Britton. I'm a professor of law at the David A. Clark School of Law. I'm a veteran law professor for over 45 years. I was the dean of the Thurgood Marshall School of Law at Texas Southern University, and I've litigated civil rights cases throughout the nation, both here in Mississippi, back in 1969 to 1973, when I was a civil rights lawyer here. I got here a little bit after the 1964 summer, but I picked up a lot of the pieces in the work from then. And I also am very active in all of the education litigation leading up to the United States Supreme Court, the 2007 Parents Involved Schools, which was probably the greatest setback to Brown versus Board of Education in Supreme Court history. I'm in there just last year in the current affirmative action case called Fisher versus the University of Texas at Austin. I was involved in the decision this year that upheld the right of white voters in Michigan to ban affirmative action after the Supreme Court just some 6 years earlier had approved it in what are known as the Michigan cases. And I've been asked to lead this panel on the education crisis because I'm a specialist in educational equality under the law. And to my immediate right or left, I would ask John Hale to introduce himself.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Hale, and it is an incredible honor and privilege to be sitting up here right now to talk about some of these issues related to the crisis in public education, and especially here at this historic institution at Tougaloo. I just want to start out just saying telling you a little bit about who I am, because many times when I talk about the freedom schools and African American history and civil rights history, people ask, why am I sitting up here? I'm a white male. I'm from the state of Wisconsin, where, yes, of course, I grew up very close to dairy farms, and the civil rights movement really never made it that far. There wasn't much going on in terms of diversity in rural Wisconsin, where I was from. I was a high school history teacher, and I was reading everything and anything by a historian and activist by the name of Howard Zinn, who I'm sure many of in the room know. And I could just say I was very inspired by all of his writing. People's History was a foundational text for me while I was in college, and it really shaped my perception on the world. And I came across an article he published in 1964 in The Nation entitled "The Freedom Schools in Context." And here I was a young history teacher. I was looking at schools as a place to change society, and this article struck me as a solution. It wasn't it was exciting, but it wasn't necessarily so different as it was, again, a solution, a practical solution, because the freedom schools applied radical theory to educational practice, which is exactly what I was looking for. When I went to graduate school to study specifically the history of education and to earn my PhD in that very field, I pursued studying the freedom schools. This brought me to the University of Illinois, where I earned my PhD. Writing my dissertation on the freedom schools, I stuck with this research. It's now a book manuscript, or a book manuscript under review, I should say. And following Howard Zinn, following this history, and of course, it's not just Howard Zinn, it's hundreds and thousands of local people who participated in the movement. What I realized was that I can't just be a teacher or an author. You're a teacher, you're an author, you try to be an activist. And the Freedom School model really gave me something to follow. I'm now a professor at the College of Charleston in South Carolina. It's the first time I've lived in the South. And with my interest in the freedom schools, this has introduced me to grassroots educational reform in the South. Since moving to Charleston 3 years ago, going on 4 years, I had the great opportunity to meet and work very closely with Dave Dennis, and who is not in this room right now. He's following what he was doing 50 years ago. He's traveling all over the state on any given day, and he's doing the same thing here today. But meeting Dave Dennis, working with the Algebra Project, has allowed me to practice a freedom school idea, to teach about the freedom schools, to teach about this history, but then also to teach about the concepts behind the freedom schools, which is a subject I will elaborate upon later. And what I try to do is not only teach my students, both history students and education students, that education is an inherently political act, and the freedom schools have provided us a model to follow. And if you look at organizations like the Young People's Project and Algebra Project, we see this historical continuity between the freedom schools and contemporary organizations to change schools, to implement and organize around a quality education for all students. So thank you. I look forward to working with you over the course of the next few days. And again, I'm very honored to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Our next speaker is somewhat typical of the courageousness of all the civil rights veterans, for she was just asked to fill in this role less than 24 hours ago. And she's come here prepared under such short notice to participate, and it is a great pleasure to present to you Millicent Brown.
Thank you. Thank you, and okay, I'll do a quick stand-up. All right.
Should have put us on the stage, huh?
Yeah, right. Okay. Thank you, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. It may have been short notice, but it really isn't. I think I've spent a lifetime getting ready to be here with you today. So it doesn't really take a whole lot of preparation. The issues we're going to be discussing are old. They have brought themselves through with different manifestations over the years, but they are continuing points of dialogue for us now and perhaps forever. But that doesn't make them any less important. If anything, that makes them even more important. I'm a native of Charleston, South Carolina. And part of my street credits that I want to make sure everybody's aware of is that while I was not here in '64, I came to Jackson in 1968 and was a part of SNCC and worked with just the most incredible team of people who forever changed my life and the direction that it would take. I came buoyed by a very strong childhood based in NAACP, which got me ready for SNCC, and then for all the other endeavors that I've done since then. I particularly have interest in public education in that it was the suit that I was the chief litigant for, Millicent Brown et al. Versus School Board District 20, which is the case that desegregated public schools in South Carolina in 1963. And so this issue of Brown and its impact and did we get what we want and all of the issues that you will hear us discussing have very personal as well as political importance to me. Beyond my movement years, when I did join the establishment and became a college professor of history, I teach the history of the civil rights movement. And I have, for the most part, always taught at historically black colleges. And so I think it's a combination of these lifetime experiences that I hope to, in some way, share and enlighten this conversation today. So thank you for having me.
Very good. Our next speaker is Dr. Raynard Sanders.
Thank you very much, John. And it is certainly a pleasure here to commemorate 50 years of this most noble work that was done by activists and young people across the country and the people of Mississippi to bring the nation's attention to what was going on here in Mississippi and across the country. So it is certainly an honor to come here and to talk about, my life work, which has been people development, and some people call it public education, but it's people development. I am from New Orleans, and I'm a public school graduate and a graduate of Dillard University, which is an HBCU, Methodist-based university in New Orleans. And upon graduating, I worked for a community organization that was founded by several core members who worked in Mississippi. And I worked with that group. It was an educational cultural program called Tambourine and Fan, and I worked with them for about 10 years. And at which point, a little bit later, I went into the school district and eventually did the teaching thing and became an assistant principal and a principal of a middle school and a high school, and went on and got a master's degree and a doctorate degree from Teachers College. From the first day that I started working with children, I thought that the most important work was the work that we did with those kids that came from poor backgrounds and minority backgrounds in New Orleans. As you all know, New Orleans is a predominantly African-American city, so most of my work has been working with those kids that no one else wanted to work with. And most of the schools that I worked with and the schools that I was a principal of was in some of the toughest neighborhoods, and that's just a whole nother story. But I retired in 2006, and along the way, before retiring, I was executive director of the national faculty that worked with poor performing schools throughout the Mississippi Delta. I also was the interim director of urban education at Southern University. And since 2006, I have been focusing on the educational equity challenges that we are facing in a privatized school district here in New Orleans. As most of you all know and saw Katrina on television, we had about 80% of the schools that were destroyed or damaged, but most of the damage has come post-Katrina. And most of the damage has come like a wolf in sheep's clothing, and has come in the name of reform, and has come in the name of charter schools and vouchers, and it's all wrapped up into a profit-making entities that has resurrected, or maybe didn't have to dig that far, many equity and challenges that we thought were over with in some form or fashion. So my work now is with a couple of groups. One is Research on Reforms, where we do research around the work around the schools that are done in New Orleans. I also am involved with another group called the New Orleans Educational Equity Roundtable, and we just recently released a video on just exactly what has happened in New Orleans, and we'll be releasing subsequent videos along with the Schott Foundation, and I'll share that with you a little bit later. And I also host a weekly radio show on public education. So today I'm really honored to come here and talk about this reform that is sweeping the country, and talk about just really what it is, and hopefully I can share that with you.
Very good, sir. Very good. Our final speaker, Dr. Earl Watkins, is the only person on the ground here in the SIP, and he'll tell you what he does in the field of education. Earl Watkins?
Good afternoon. Put this closer. As our moderator stated, I'm Earl Watkins. I'm the conservator for the Indianola School District in the Delta, and I'm also the state education chair for the Mississippi NAACP. A conservator is an individual who runs school districts in behalf of the Mississippi Department of Education, and those school districts are under state control. Indianola School District is in Sunflower County. At one point, Sunflower County had all three of its districts under state control and under conservatorship.
What is the you mean to be under state control? How did they get under state control?
You can go under state control for several reasons. For issues related to finances, issues related to the accreditation standards identified by the Mississippi Department of Education. There could be a state of emergency related to safety issues within the school district. So there are several standards that you have to violate in order to go into state control.
And low achievement rate too, right?
Low achievement rate can contribute to it, but it might not be the trigger to go into immediate state control. It has to be a long-term issue. In 1964, of course, I was still in the mind of God. I came on the scene in 1965. In 1965, I am a Head Start baby in Humphreys County, Louise, Mississippi. I went to school in Humphreys County High School, got my bachelor's from Mississippi Valley State University, master's and doctorate from Jackson State University. Most of my professional career was in Jackson Public Schools and ended as a superintendent for 6 years in Jackson Public Schools here in Jackson, Mississippi. Most of my work after that has been around leadership development, because I firmly believe that the quality of schools would not just depend on the quality of its teachers, but the quality of the leaders that run the schools and run the school districts as well. Poor leaders can destroy good teachers. Poor leaders will allow mediocre teachers to stay. So I focus a great deal on the quality of leadership in the work that I do. And since I've been away from the district, from Jackson Public Schools, I've been conservator for Indianola, and of course working with the Mississippi NAACP and legislative work for education. One of the things that I learned when I exited K-12 leadership after Jackson Public Schools, I discovered that all legislation really isn't about student achievement. And many of us as educators really believe that, when legislation comes, it really is about student achievement. It really is about helping children. But all legislation isn't really about education. And that's a hard pill to swallow when you come to that realization. And most of the times, legislation is about local politics, not necessarily what state impact. And so I'm very pleased to be a part of this conversation, to talk about how public education can thrive and strive in the state of Mississippi, because I'm very concerned about what's happening to children. We have focused so much on hurting children through school, testing children, instead of making sure children exit our doors educated well. And we have got to change the perspective on that.
Dr. John Hill, let's start with you in a little history from then until now.
Okay.
Freedom schools, the pursuit not only of the right to register in 1964, but to free our children and help educate them from the metaphor of shackles of segregated education.
Sure.
You have about 5 minutes.
Okay. It all comes down to 5 minutes, no pressure. So there's a lot to say, and a lot of the questions were given, this is the 60th anniversary of the Brown v. Board of Education decision, and let's be very clear, the promises of Brown have not been realized. One of the problematic issues with Brown, I feel like, is it taught America, and especially taught white Americans, that the problem with segregated education was it created an inferior black system of education, or black children suffered, which is true, but white children also suffered. Okay, so first of all, it affected everybody in the United States, all children and all students. This was not just a quote-unquote African-American problem. But also throughout the litigation surrounding Brown, there was an argument that black education was necessarily inferior and it had to be integrated. And this is not true. Yes, there's not equal funding, which led to disastrous issues of public education. But when you really look at the history of schools prior to Brown, you begin to see some historical solutions that can guide our reform efforts today. First and foremost, I really see is the organization of young people. When you look at the history of the NAACP, for instance, beginning in 1919, Walter White specifically called for the organization of young people. And when we're talking about young people and we think about Freedom Summer, we often think of college students, yes, very young. But the NAACP Youth Council was talking about middle schoolers, students in high school. They were talking about organizing youth. And this is exactly what the NAACP Youth Council did. They organized middle schoolers and students still in high school around civil rights issue. Well before Brown, you had young students still in middle and high school who were organizing, striking, conducting boycotts, and leading local projects in the schools. So we had young students attending public schools who were learning how to organize and how to protest. And just a few instances here. If you look in Prince Edward County, Virginia, the court case, one of the 5 court cases that comprise a Brown decision, began with a high school student, with a high school walkout who closed down the public schools. Barbara Johns led a walkout that shut down the schools. They walked downtown and they contacted the NAACP office. This was young people, not even in college, organizing on their own. Colette Colvin in Montgomery, months before Rosa Parks gave up her seat, the story we know. She was in high school. She was studying the Constitution in the humanities course. And she had the idea, she was also learning about boycotts and a long history of boycotting within the long civil rights movement. She decided to sit down on a white section of the bus. Again, this is a student in high school organizing on their own. The point I'm trying to make is educators, professional educators, saw young people as activists, and they tailored public education to teach people to be activists. To jump forward to today, we can look at organizations like the Algebra Project or the Young People's Project and begin who conceptualizes the student as an activist. We can train young people to be activists. This goes along with the organization of teachers. Teachers somehow have in the mindset collectively, nationally, that education is an apolitical act, that politics should not be involved in the classroom. I don't know, if you look at the long history of education, I don't know where they get that idea from. I don't. History of education teaches us that education is inherently a political act. And this is something that Mr. James Campbell says all the time from Charleston, a teacher organizer himself, that education is inherently political. People shouldn't go into teaching to get 3 months off to raise a family. They should see this as an opportunity to change the system. And when you look at black teachers associations across the South before Brown, you see a small yet very vocal number of teachers who put their jobs, their careers, and sometimes lives on the line around this very issue. Before Brown, the NAACP legal strategy called for the equalization of teacher salaries. Teachers had to stand up, and they were faced a lot of hostility for putting their names on the line on these lawsuits. So we look at the organization of young people, and we look at the organization of teachers. Now again, if you flash forward to today, the South Carolina, where I teach, is a right-to-work state. Teachers are not allowed to unionize. So no wonder that they think that education is an apolitical act or without politics. We have to educate our teachers to be political, to understand that education is inherently a political act. It is not dangerous or illegal to look at our students as potential social and political change agents. History is telling us to do this. We have to revisit this problematic history and see that there are solutions within this. So in Charleston, South Carolina, what we're trying to do is work with locally segregated schools, schools that are still public, not yet charter schools, but they're going to be soon. And when you ask questions, for instance, there's this nationally known school, it's called Burke High School. It is the only public high school left in the city of Charleston. It is built, it's a state-of-the-art school built to hold 1,500 students. It is at half capacity. Of course, as you can guess, 99% African American. That 1% are students who don't know it's all black and they transfer out before the first month is over. When you go in there, and we've done this with Bob Moses and Dave Dennis, Millicent Brown, we've walked into that high school and asked the question, what is the history of Burke High School? They don't know. They're not taught this. But when they begin to learn the history, they begin to ask the questions, why don't we learn this history? Why don't our teachers live in the community? Why do we receive such bad publicity in the local press? So again, how do we ask those questions? We organize local teachers, we organize local students, and just by asking the question, in my mind, and I may still be naive, but following the model that Dave, Millicent, Mr. Campbell, Bob have put forward, just by asking the questions, we begin to see children, young people, young students, really young activists, begin to ask the questions that will lead to fundamental social and political change.
All right, Dr. John. We got your message, both historically and currently. If you organize the students and you organize the teachers, which will spread to the community. You will lead to better support for education. And do you have any research on whether students in any of these models went on to achieve at a higher level?
Students organized in the 50s and 60s?
Yes.
Yes. Well, a young activist sitting right next to me
Well, then that might be a good transition.
is a textbook example of what can happen to young
Thank you very much. Millicent Brown,
Yeah.
what do you think the past represents? You were active in it as the Linda Brown of South Carolina.
Yeah, how about
the
that?
student face.
I call it the Little Brown decision. There
Little
was the
Brown
Big Brown
decision, that's right.
There was the Little Brown
The
decision.
student face of the Brown versus Board of Education equivalent in South Carolina to desegregate the schools.
Mm-hmm.
And now you are a PhD and you are dealing with educational reform.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see in the past and what lies in the future?
Okay. Let me say that I'm always very, very optimistic about discussions in groups like this that meet and talk about how we use the past and project to what has to happen in the future. I don't want to stay mired in the past, but I do think we have to have a foundation upon which to build that John began to pull out. And Bob Moses and I and Dave Dennis and I have talked about this a few times. I don't want to overplay, but it has to be on the record that when we started this whole school desegregation process, so many of us at the time did not understand and don't teach subsequently that there was no miraculous thing that people thought was going to happen if black people started sitting next to white people, and that they were through osmosis somehow going to get educated. Therefore, Brown was never intended as about whether or not we desegregated and mixed the races. We have to just make that fine point because there was, throughout this entire nation, a network of all black schools that believed and were based on excellence. And we somehow have to remind ourselves that in spite of all the bad resources and all the facilities that were not there and all of the problems caused by poverty, we have to remind people that standards for excellence were in place. And for many of us, perhaps not in many rural, remote areas, but for those of us who come from some kind of urban environments, we know that all black schools provided us with the kind of foundation to go to college and beyond and to be the leaders in our communities. We have to start our history acknowledging that fact first. I would... Thank you. Yeah. The reason I found that I just believe more, the older I get, the more I believe it important to just take time to make that acknowledgement was that when desegregation came in the early 60s to South Carolina, and I was just honored to be a part of that first group of pioneers. It was a very confusing kind of a transformation because the assumption was that I had come from deprivation and nothing. And so it was really important that people understand that the black community, in spite of its burdens, had this complete commitment to excellence, and we had been somehow maneuvering the American landscape even though we had to do it at such great peril. The meaning of Brown, therefore, has to be laid out first, that we were there because we wanted equal resources. You know, I happen to have come from a high school where literally a potter's field that was right adjacent to the present-day Burke High School that you mentioned, where impoverished people who had no families to bury them threw their dead bodies into this potter's field by the city. My biology teacher in the all-black system actually taught biology by the remains that surfaced when it rained. And that's how they found bones in order to teach us human anatomy and biology. Now, I leave that and go to an all-white school where I've never seen a locker. You know, I didn't even understand, where our parents had to find the funding to build a school cafeteria, because that wasn't part of what the county provided for black schools, you know. So there is this incredible, incredible transformation that was confusing for whites as well as blacks at the time, but it has to be a part of the story that without resources, we had doctors and we had lawyers and we had nurses and educators and insurance men and teachers, and we were somehow still doing it. And so it seems to me that part of the message we have got to really argue today is, please let's not buy into this idea that one's social class is the determinant of one's educational achievement, you know, and all of the other kinds of constructs that have been in place since Brown that have confused the issues. And I would just suggest that while we know the purpose of Brown was to break down, and we had to break down, I'm not one of these people that believes that we go back to some romanticized, you know, well, we were better off separate. No, that's not the answer. The integration of our society has got to be the ongoing role. But the way we interpret that integration is fundamental. And it cannot be built on this idea of black inferiority, black deprivation, and as if it was just as in slavery was the problem of the enslaved, that the problem of segregated schools was because of the inability of the black kids that were in them.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
I'll cut it short for now.
And I'll
I'm
come
sorry.
back to you.
Yeah.
Dr. Watkins, I'd like to go over to you in the present. 50 years ago, we didn't deal with these terms, the achievement gap between non-white and white students, in addition to non-white and poor students, students with disabilities, and in this rapidly emerging, diverse society of the United States, students whose first language is not English, or therefore the gap for English language learners, which according to an article in the paper just the other day, there's a wider gap for English language learners than there is even for low income and African American students. And we didn't talk about the lower college matriculation rates. We didn't talk about the school to prison pipeline. How do you address these issues today as a former superintendent here, as a conservator for non-performing districts, and your other educational activities?
I will start out by saying that we didn't judge schools the same way at that time. We didn't judge schools the same way at the time. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure if we judged schools at all at that time. Schools were judged primarily by the quality of what teachers did in the classroom and the passion that parents had to ensure that their children received the quality of education. We didn't talk about the dropout rate then as we talk about the dropout rate now, because coming through the years, over that 50-year time period, there were things that people could do if they didn't go to school to get a 12th grade, to get a high school diploma, what have you. But as businesses continue to move outside of the U.S., those factory jobs, those industry jobs, those manual labor jobs no longer exist as they once existed. So as the U.S. becomes more technologically motivated in its career-minded pursuits for its citizens, we're finding that folk now have to have a higher level of education than once was required. So as we look at the assessments that are now used to account for schools or to provide accountability, we no longer look at how we teach the children. It really is more about how we measure schools. Now we use children as the camouflage in the process to make folk think it's about children, but it really is about putting a grade on a school, putting a grade on a school district, and we miss the fact that children have to be able to perform well after they finish our schools. And I point to this as an issue, especially in many of our low-performing schools that are predominantly African American. In my experience and what I've seen in the state, We use test events as hurdles that children must overcome. Once I get you to be proficient, then I must prepare you for the next hurdle. And in too many of our schools where we're serving our children, once you pass state exams at the high school, we act like school is over for our children, instead of making sure that our children are prepared for a career and or college. So until we change the mindset in terms of what we really want for children, the achievement gap will continue, because actually if we were as concerned about an achievement gap, we would fully fund education. We will ensure that we produce quality teachers. We will ensure that every child in the state of Mississippi went to kindergarten, which is not required by law right now, if we really wanted to ensure that we were going to close the achievement gap. And we know that pre-K has an impact on the quality of a child's experience K-12, but we fight over whether we're going to provide funding for pre-K. So the question is, are we really concerned about children, or is it really about the dollar? Are we really trying to provide a class of people who are fully educated, who is fully educated? Are we trying to create a system that will continue to perpetuate kids who are undereducated? So the question is going to be, what do we do to ensure that Valley, Alcorn, Jackson State receives the same resources as the other 5 major universities in Mississippi to produce quality teachers, to produce quality students who are ready to go in the teacher experience? How do we ensure that we do more than just fund groups like, I hope I have a job after I say this, Teach for America, so that we can have quality teachers in the classroom? Teach for America is just a Band-Aid on a problem that has not yet healed.
Well, thank you very much, sir. And with a plug to the next panel that follows this on higher education, one of the subjects in that discussion on higher education will be the future and the plight of historically black colleges and universities, as he named, in terms of Alcorn and Valley and Jackson State universities here in Mississippi. Today, in the city of New Orleans, as many of my dear friends, including Edie and Lake Jones here, up from Nolens, point out that this fall, New Orleans will become the first large, perhaps only, school district in the country in which there are no public schools. All the schools will be charter schools. So New Orleans has become ground zero for the privatization of education through charter schools, caused by a number of factors that I will ask Renard to comment on. But one of them was a natural disaster in terms of Katrina. But there were some human disasters taking place before that, and certainly after that storm to contribute. And of course, the new kind of 900-pound gorilla in the room of educational equity these days, over the last 14 years, is the No Child Left Behind Act, as well as the new national educational attainment goals through the Common Core state standards. So now tell us a little bit about what charter schools represent for New Orleans, including a massive amount of young Teach for America students filling the classroom teacher needs in New Orleans, and what it means for the rest of the nation, too, in terms of educational equity, especially for children of color.
Well, I think that, and I think you're absolutely right, and I have argument with Bill Ayers and Rick Ayers about Chicago being ground one and ground zero in New Orleans. So I told him we below sea level. So I think that we kind of have him on that. But it is being painted with a very well-financed national narrative that charter schools and privatizing public education is the solution. And it goes along with what John talked about, that the way that we do this is that we continue this test and punish and grade schools, as Earl has said. And so there's this articles that come out in the New York Times and the Washington Post telling you how wonderful New Orleans is and how they have reduced the number of failing schools, and now that everyone has school choice. Now, to folks who are just not educators, when you peel back the onion, and sometimes we always putting putting water on the symptoms, but when you peel back the onions, it just does not make any sense that we're going to fire all of the teachers that are trained, that are certified, and we're going to bring in some young people with 5 weeks of training, and they're going to teach our kids algebra, and they're going to understand our kids. They have not had a course in methods. They don't have a course in psychology of kids, but they're telling us that New Orleans is the model and that we should fire all of the teachers, those poor teachers in New Orleans, and hire these Teach for America people.
And Raynard, were the teachers, who coincidentally were members of the teachers union, blackballed from reapplying in education after that?
Yes, they were blocked, and once they realized that they couldn't get enough to man the school, they began to slowly hire them, and then as the years went on, 2 or 3 years after Katrina, they summarily fired them and brought in the Teach for America. So most of the schools in New Orleans, in the reform schools, are Teach for America people who have no experience, don't stay long, and it is reflected in our scores. Because despite the national narrative, the Recovery School District, which is the state school district that has started all of these charter schools, has been the worst performing school district in the state of Louisiana. Its ACT score is the lowest median ACT score in the state of Louisiana, such that a child cannot get into any Louisiana college. Much more importantly, we have these zero tolerance schools where these kids, instead of being in prep, college prep, they're in prison prep, where they are walking on yellow lines, where they are suspended if they sleep in class. If they don't raise their hand and lock their elbow, then they get a demerit. If they disagree, they get a demerit. If they walk down the hall, and the way that it reads in this handbook by this group called Collegiate Academies, and the scholar, which is the student, sees a teacher, he or she is to smile at that teacher and be grateful that those teachers are there, who are predominantly white, who are, as I said, Teach for America inexperienced, who we have these high-paid salaries for principals and CEOs making 6 digits, who are predominantly white. So I think that in order for us to really understand this is to get away from the symptoms a little bit and really understand that here in America, that many people in America and a lot of people with money are not interested in providing education to poor and minority students, period. And they are going to do anything that they can do to stop it and to circumvent it. So this charter school movement, all in the name of reform, basically are some places that they call schools, but really don't act as schools. They're more concerned about shaping a child's behavior and make them listen to them and molding them in a way that they want them to be molded rather than teaching them. They're more concerned about charging for that child, and now our schools have become profit entities instead of schools of education. Instead where people can
let
learn.
me just play the devil's advocate
Sure.
a moment. There are many people of color, and others too, who want the choice between a charter school and a public school. And I don't want to focus on that controversial documentary, Waiting for Superman, but there are many folks who greatly exhale when their children win the lottery to a very high-achieving school, whether it's public or private, but often it's private charter. And there are a number of charter schools that seem to be performing well, particularly with large numbers of low-income and minority children, such as the KIPP Academy, just to mention one. What do you say to that information?
Well, the first thing is that in New Orleans, we don't have that kind of lottery. And in New Orleans, school choice is the schools choosing and not the students or the parents choosing.
Oh, there's no
And-
choice for parents in the lottery norms?
No. You have three choices. You might get your fourth or fifth choice that's not on there. And you can go from one failing school to another failing school. So it's more of the schools choosing than the teachers, than the students choosing. So the lottery is very, very skewed such that the schools have the opportunity to select the kids that they want, okay? The other thing is that I don't think that we should, and I'm not saying that this is happening widespread in New Orleans, I don't think that we should be able to measure a school district's success on whether or not they are able to cream this from a student population and take the best kids. I think that we should measure
And reject children
and reject children.
who need special education services.
Normal. No,
And
not
I was
necessarily-
involved in the
yeah,
suit
special,
against
yeah.
New Orleans. And
Yeah,
against the state
yeah,
takeover
yeah.
because it allowed the charter schools to exclude children with special
And
needs
that's
because
an
they didn't want to
ongoing,
pay for it.
that's an ongoing federal lawsuit now.
Right.
But we should measure school districts by how well we take care of those kids that come from poor communities, that come behind in school. We should be talking about raising the floor and not grabbing 20 kids or 30 kids or maybe 80 kids and saying, look how well we did with the best and brightest. That is not the solution for urban education in America, and neither is the solution for most of the poor minority people in this country, because most of them come to school. They either are average kids, they may be over average kids, but they need some assistance. You know, it's like them coming to the hospital. You know, if you had a hospital and all you took was the kids who had a colds and the flu, and you didn't take the people with the heart attacks, nobody dies in your hospital, right? I mean, come on now, right?
All right. Let me ask the panel this question. With some invitation to challenge the underlying supposition, it's somewhat of a syllogism, Bob Moses. Unless we desegregate neighborhoods, we can't desegregate schools. And unless we desegregate schools, the doors to opportunity for too many black students will continue to be closed. Is that a set of valid assumptions that leads to the conclusion? Dr. John?
I think when you're looking at education and reform, and this is based on my experience of working with a reform movement in Charleston, is that there's an assumption that desegregation means white families bringing in their resources to a movement. I would never want to assume that white resources and white families are needed to improve a school. So there, I would think there is an erroneous belief in there to say that.
But white families, particularly with some influence, has often been a proxy for more political as well as economic support for schools. And certainly it has also, by documentation, identified schools that have a much higher achievement rate.
True, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Again,
All
there's
right.
historic example to prove otherwise. As Dr. Brown talked about excellence or standards of excellence, who's to say that we can not have an all-black school or an all-Hispanic or Latino
Now, that's
school
the test out there today.
and not be an excellent school? The federal government, for instance, and if we look at this organizing tool as quality education as a constitutional right, that would support an all-minority school to be a excellent school.
And this is to other members of the panel, can a school that's at least 85 to 90% non-white and about the same percentage, if not more, poor, be equal or likely to succeed?
Let me say this. I think that, we have pre-the Brown, post-Brown, pre-Katrina, we've had some great schools working with African American kids in poor communities.
Right.
We have had great models in every
But aren't
city.
they more the exception than the rule?
It has been more the exception merely because we don't support that. We don't spread that kind of knowledge from school to school. And more what we have done, we have disenfranchised those other schools by giving them less money and by not sharing what those other schools are doing. So I think the notion that we cannot have a black school, an all-black poor school that does well, I think that has been thrown out the window long ago by models here in the city and other places too.
Go ahead, Dr. John, and then Dr. Brown next.
And real quick, I would say one of the unintended consequences of Brown, in my interpretation, is that all black education or all Hispanic education is necessarily inferior. And when you look at white media coverage, this is what you see in the press. You hear violence, or there's stories circulating around in the community that it's dangerous to attend certain schools, which just aren't true. So the media and popular interpretations of schools support this idea that all black or all Hispanic education must necessarily be inferior, and that's just not true.
Dr. Brown.
I just want to throw something out because although in this room we come from all parts of the nation, I think there is one phenomenon that most of us are all familiar with, and that is that of gentrification. And so I'm going to add to this discussion the very idea that you can keep moving around if you want to. But there is, unfortunately, because of the legacy of racism in this country, that no matter where people go, somebody is going to move away from you. And so that part of town that was the desired part to go to, and there's going to be some integration and we're going to all get along well, 5 months later, it has become all black, all Hispanic, all white, whatever. And something we learned very early in the day was this whole idea of where is our place? Because every time that somebody changes the rules, they change our place. So my pragmatic response that we cannot look to desegregated neighborhoods as being the secret, because neighborhoods come and go and change all the time.
As we know from gentrification today,
Which is
taking
what-
place in the city,
Exactly.
all the way
So
down
we
to the
can't-
loop of
we
Chicago.
We can't base what we consider the quality experience on that by the people. It has to be by the standards of the teaching that goes on within the buildings.
All right.
As to the conversation, we tend to leave out is the intangible, or are those intangible components of what drive the quality of a child's education or the quality of an education in a community. Right. If you compare the intangible in our communities from 64 present and beyond, those things that made schools great, or those things that cause us to reflect on how good school was for us, someone said, boy, Earl, you gotta be better than. Earl, you need to be sure that. Earl, if you don't, then this will be the end result. It seems to be taboo now in our schools that we can't say to a black child that if you don't work toward a quality education, this is what your end result. We are ticking off those tangible things. We're trying to find the right legislation, the right policy, the right school program, the right plan in order to ensure that kids get a quality education. I want to know, where is the right passion within our communities to ensure that our children understand their history and to know that they come from a great people? And if they don't add to the value of their own people by carrying on the message and the work that they do every day, the right policy will never be passed, the right legislation will never be written, the right plan will never come about, because we never actually address what drives the passion, what drives the force behind a quality education.
All right, get your questions ready, because I'm turning to you after this last question. Dr. Brown. School desegregation in the 1960s was about breaking the back of Jim Crow segregation.
Absolutely.
As history will reflect, Brown probably did more to integrate the rest of the society in terms of housing, in terms of employment, in terms of access to public and private accommodations than it did in integrating our schools. Right. Nevertheless, education, though, was still considered to be a top priority for the civil rights community because the segregation was so unequal and so apparent. Why do you think education is not a civil rights priority today within our communities of color?
Very complex question. Simply, we have devalued education as an entire culture, okay? I mean the entire country. I mean, this has no race attached to it. We are in a process of dumbing down. You know, we're tech savvy and we're talking about lauding all the wonders of technology, but at the same time, we are making those opportunities narrower and narrower for fewer and fewer people to really, really embrace the rewards of that technology. And so we have done what you just alluded to, this idea of creating standards without looking at, well, where is the human component to this? What is the goal that we are really striving for? What is an educated person? The person who knows how to work this particular machine or this computer, or is it someone who understands what a sense of community and responsibility to neighborhood and other people really are? And those are not forces that have to be antagonistic to one another. They really aren't. But the point is, we have not taken our definition of modern day education and added to it learning how to use the technology as a way to build better communities for all people. You know, we've we've pitted people against each other as opposed to found ways to which this is going to benefit everybody.
Now we're going to shift the program to you, and I'm going to take some questions. Go ahead.
My question, one is, how are schools, just a practical matter, how are schools funded in Mississippi? Is it property taxes, everything goes through?
All right, the question is, and this is,
It affects how you do.
yes, the question is, how is education funded in Mississippi?
To the extent it's funded at all.
We have what's called the MAEP funding process, Mississippi Adequate Education Program. Through the law that was passed in 1997 to reformulate the funding process for public schools in Mississippi, as some might say, to prevent a lawsuit against the underfunding of schools starting in 1997. But even since that time, many of us in our field have tried to count how many times it's actually been fully funded according to the formula. But the formula is a combination of funds that come through the legislative appropriation and also ad valorem taxes from the local community.
You say ad valorem, you mean?
Property taxes. Property
Yes.
taxes.
So you're an agricultural state where all the property owners have a drive to keep property taxes as low as possible, and then you have a state equalization formula that is not quite doing the job. Is that correct?
That's correct. As a matter of fact, if you just take one school district like Jackson Public Schools, if you look at how Jackson Public Schools has been underfunded from fiscal year 11 to fiscal year 2014 by the MAEP formula, Jackson Public Schools has been underfunded by $61 million.
And one of the responses of a movement taking place right now in Mississippi is to collect enough signatures to put an initiative on the ballot to establish a much stronger fundamental right to education for all children on an equal basis, which would strengthen the obligations upon the state legislature to adequately fund education. In addition, I'm not letting too much of a secret out in the audience, but I'm also working with a group of lawyers with a large outside law firm, and they are looking at whether they could successfully bring a challenge to the inadequate and unequal funding of education here in Mississippi today. Next question from this side. Yes, young lady. What is your name?
My name is Judy. I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I just had a question, Ms. Brown. We were talking about the assumption of deprivation and lack of resources in schools related to people. I'm just feeling sorry for students who are coming into these segregated schools. Where I work in Minneapolis, we have de facto segregated schools, which means, you know, all the deliberate speed of brown, the schools black schools. And another one.
Right, so your question is, did desegregation have an impact upon businesses in the black community?
Yeah.
Does anyone know about that history?
What I would like to say is, I think getting at what you were originally trying to talk about is we have to understand that while we look at Brown as a particular cross point for the 20th century, the real point is that there are as many ongoing psychological reasons and barriers as there are economic. The two don't go in isolation. And so as blacks and others were able to take advantage of a more open society, that then continued this idea of the inferiority of that which is all black or brown, okay? And then that over time led to resources just bleeding out of minority communities. And so I'm saying to you, yes, there's a relationship, but it's not just the money. It's also the money and how that follows the interpretation, the thinking, such that now we have young people who really devalue their own culture, who they are, because they've had a couple of generations now of feeling that they are on this dark side of the whole issue.
All right.
I taught, let me just say one example. I've taught in all black schools where I thought I was doing something by saying, let me tell you about the school, the all black school that I went to. And I would use these examples and whatever. And then finally a black student would say to me, Dr. Brown, when you say all black, we think ghetto. And I realized that I was not understanding what 20 or 30 years had done, that we had psychologically just embedded this notion that to be of one race, one ethnic group, what have you, is in fact inferior. That's why the Algebra Project and other kinds of efforts to say, wait a minute, stop isolating things as belonging to this race or that.
All right, back over to this side. I see. I'll ask you the first question. No, the fellow in the back, you had your hand up first. And then right here, then I'll come back over to the other side. Yes, sir. What's your name?
My name is Irving. I have one question. Is there any good news from the mountain?
Is there any good news from the mountain? Yes. And I'm put the panel on notice that we have about 30 minutes left, but I'm going to reserve about the last 5 minutes for you to throw out to the audience your proposal for a remedy, for action, to carry back to the workshop this afternoon. Yes, he said, is there any bright light, good news on top of the mountain about 50 years later from Mississippi Freedom Summer in the field of education?
Well, I can say that in New Orleans, the good news is that people are starting to get it now and starting to resist the privatization of schools. And most of this privatization was done when most of the city was depopulated and most of the people didn't know what was going on. So now they are getting it that the schools are not public schools anymore, that they are privately managed charters run by a board that does not look like them, does not share a budget with them, and take the kids who they want. It also has become good news and that people are beginning to understand that this reform movement is nothing more than controlling resources and which kids go to what schools. And that's going to start the movement that we're going to need to stop this, I think, the largest crisis that has ever hit public education since we have been able to go to school.
We haven't mentioned it, but any educational researcher will tell you today, more children of color, just African American for an example, are doing better in achievement today. They're graduating, they're going to college, earning more money. It's just that whites are also doing better too, and the number of poor children is increasing, and they're not doing so well, and that's what's creating the achievement gap between the haves and the have-nots. And if you want to take it all the way up to the college level, and you want to take standardized testing, such as the SAT or the ACT, it's just making colleges whiter and richer and excluding more people of color and more poorer students. Yes, you had your hand up. I recognized you earlier. What is your name in the black shirt? Yes, you. Yes.
My name is Howard Kirschenbaum. When I got back from the summer of 1964 in Mississippi, I wanted to become a teacher and an educator, and I did. And back then, we who thought of ourselves as radical educators wanted to be able to do alternative schools. We could only do a school our own way, show them how it could work. And now we find many of us find ourselves seeing a version of that in charter schools.
That's right.
Going awry. So my question is, how do you reconcile what could be a wonderful idea to allow local people and excited educators to have their own school and experiment with the pitfalls that can occur when a system is based on charter schools?
That's a very good question, and certainly we all want to be careful not to lump all charter schools as bad schools, because as you say, there are some good charter schools, there's some creative educators and administrators who are creating schools, and certainly the structure of charter school itself should probably be looked upon as a valuable tool, if done right, to create exceptions to the public schools. It's just this massive charterization and the question of the future of public schools. Anybody want to take his question? Dr. John.
I'll start to answer that, but I first want to address the question about good news. I just want to say, if you look at the work of students who are organized around the Algebra Project and Young People's Project, they're doing very inspirational work. I heard representatives of the Baltimore Algebra Project are here. I haven't met them yet, but certainly their work in Baltimore is inspiring to see what young people are doing in the schools. In terms of charter schools and looking at the 60s to create an alternative school, the original idea of the charter schools as proposed by, I forget if it's Roy or Ray Buddy, and then eventually picked up by
Ray Good, original.
Okay.
Ray Hood.
Okay, who just recently passed away. The original idea of the charter schools was to create an alternative school for up to 5 years with the understanding that those teachers would go back to the public school system and implement those changes. What has since happened is charter schools have become a segregated, separate system of education. They are constantly allowed to renew their charter. So the original idea is great to apply experiential education, find out what works, as long as you apply it back to the institution that is serving poor students and or students of color as well. But what has happened is you're creating a separate segregated system where those solutions are not incorporated, or rather institutionalized into the public school system.
There is a kind of perverse good news. In the state of Mississippi, the charter school movement has not caught on fire yet. But over time it's going to come, and over the past 2 years, the Mississippi legislature has opened the door a little more and more each year for charter schools, right, Dr. Watkins?
That's correct.
But you don't have that charter school rush here in Mississippi, even by the legislature yet.
I'd like to respond to the good news and then to the alternative school question that was posed. Number one, good news. I think some of you might disagree. I think implementation of Common Core state standards is good news. Remember, they're a set of standards. That's not a curriculum. I get concerned about folk who want local control, because local control in the state of Mississippi have been tantamount to the undereducation or the maleducation or the ill education of African American children. And it has ended up being underfunding of public schools in the state of Mississippi. So be careful about we want local control, because local control has not equated to a quality education for all children. But we got to have standards to ensure that our kids are exposed to an education that will prepare them beyond their city limits and beyond their county. So I think Common Core is good news. The other piece around alternative education, number one, charter schools began, I believe, with the American Federation of Teachers, around teachers really wanting to really identify quality strategies that will help children. But the concept has been hijacked and has become a way of basically breaking public school districts up in order to extract funding for particular reasons, not necessarily about the education of kids. And now you see where you have a mass of charter schools. If you'll see, I believe in KIPP Houston, KIPP New York, they're now forming a network of schools. So they're breaking districts up and recreating districts around charter schools.
Right, and the District of Columbia for a stat.
So it's about control of the flow of funding. And so people are prospering off of the failure of minority children and those who are certainly in poverty.
In Washington, D.C., where I am,
And also,
they're about to have more children in charter schools than public schools, and they are the only district, I believe, Renard, that has a separate charter school board, of which the public school board has no control over the students who attend charter schools.
Well, I think the big thing that you have to do, and I
That
think
Congress did that.
I think Dr. Watson said it, that some of these charter schools, and all of them are not bad, are predatory charters. And the thing that we have to do is take the profit out of it. If you
All
take
right.
the profit out of it, then you don't get these entrepreneurs that are coming in here making
Coming
$600,000
this
and
way.
$700,000, buying buildings. The buildings are in their names, and then the charter school pays them the rest of their life. So public education is not. We can't let it be a profit-making entity. And we certainly can't let them fool us, like they're saying from New Orleans, that you got to have an entrepreneur in your school in order for it to work.
Right.
So the whole model that you talked about and that I understand it to be is totally different. That is rolling out on the ground across America.
All right, coming here, and I had recognized the lady in the back. Yes, sir.
Dr. Watson and I have talked about this.
What is your name?
Joseph Haynes, and I'm a local, well, I live in non-Jackson, from New Orleans, in Boston. But I'm an active children in the legislature. You're right. The door is open for charter schools. The presentation, I mean, they're bringing in the slickest presenters they can. They're all black. And I told them one time I wasn't. I'm not for it anymore. You can't take an underfunded system, take money out of that, give it to someone else, and say do better.
Right.
That's crazy. But anyway.
Yes, sir.
How can you establish a funding mechanism that's based on 1860s and it wasn't designed to educate black or poor white and it was still operating in Mississippi today? It won't work.
I think he's already answered the question. It won't work. But if the state had only funded what it put in place in 1997, we would be much farther down the road in our ability to educate our children. And if we would ensure that communities would take ownership of their children and of their schools to ensure that they're fully funded and that kids are in school and that parents are part of school and communities take ownership of their schools, we've got to, that will improve the quality of schools a whole lot better. Right now, schools are operating as separate entities from their schools, and it never works well when that happens. So communities have got to take charge again and establish what they want from their schools.
All right, the lady in the rear. What's your name?
Mark Susan, I'm from Detroit, and I'm going to start with the cynical part because I am from Detroit. We've got emergency managers in our school system, we've got emergency managers in our city, so this issue is much broader than school, but schools are important. Derek Johnson this morning talked about morality, and we've got to get our morality right. People talked about students don't matter, people don't matter, money matters, and people have got to wake up and stop buying the goods that the money is trying to buy and start speaking up for our kids and for our cities and for our infrastructure and for our government.
All right. I heard you. Two more there. I'll take two more. The lady right here. Who else? And gentleman right there. Go ahead, ma'am.
My name is Angela Washington. I'm from Washington, D.C., and I can fully appreciate the comments you made about the charter schools and kids. So I want to make a comment and ask.
Make the comment quick, please.
I'll make it very quick. So my comment is that in the areas that have been gentrified in Washington, D.C., the Washington Post said that it is more likely that a student will get into before they will get into a public charter school in a gentrified area. It frightens me. Now, at the same time, my child attends a charter school in Washington, D.C.
And you happy with it?
Not fully. Why? Because the schools in the district where I live is not, which is not the best neighborhood. The schools are failing.
Right, right.
And that's primarily because they're underfunded. So I say all that to say, I don't know what to do.
I hear you.
don't know where to start.
I hear
don't know
you.
where the help is. I don't know who and how. And I think come to these conferences and walk away not knowing exactly what to do. So my question is, what do we do?
What do you say, panelists? Who wants to tackle that very tough question?
Okay.
All right. Dr. Brown.
I was going to respond to the idea about where the good news is. I think we have got to understand that we're having public discourse and conversations about education more and more frequently all over the place than we have had in probably the last 30 years. Now, that's the good news for me. Now, it's filled with contention, whether to go charter, whether to go magnet. We understand how complicated this thing is because we really are trying to create a 21st century educational system. And we obviously haven't had one before. That's difficult work that is really on the backs of community people to define what do we mean by public school these days. It doesn't mean the same thing as in the 1850s or even the 1950s. So my point to you and I was certainly a confused parent and I'm a confused grandparent now, the idea is we are asking these questions openly. We are making demands about states providing provisions that education be a constitutional right. That's not language that we have had before. And we've got to hear it, spread it, encourage it, but see it as part of it's part of the answer process. That we are engaging. I know as a product of DSEG, I know that what we did was we sent children blindly into all white schools because we thought white schools had it together. And just by being there, somehow our kids were going to get educated the same. Well, it didn't take but a hot minute to see that wasn't going to happen, right? Okay, but we've retracted, and we're now seeing, as evidence today, we're having these public conversations about that's not good enough. I want more for my child. There is no easy answer. We got to work together to make it happen.
All right.
That's
the gentleman in the blue shirt.
Progress step.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Nick Daly. I'm at Antioch College. My question to the panel is how might ethnic studies, like we saw a few years ago in Arizona, impact students feeling connected to their education and the education that they're getting? I didn't go through school learning about freedom summer at all. So how might...
All right. His question is, what do any of the panelists think about the role of ethnic studies in either high school or in college? He mentioned the Arizona matter, where the Arizona legislature essentially banned high schools from teaching any exceptional history of Chicanos or Mexican Americans in the state of Arizona, as if they were trying to wipe the slate clean of that very significant segment of the population. Also would include the history of Native American Indians in the state. So what do you think is the role of ethnic studies in education today? Anyone want to take that? Go ahead.
One avenue this opens is to teach students that we do not live in a colorblind society, that our society is constructed along issues of race and class. And ethnic studies really brings out that history that this race as a socially constructed category has significantly shaped the history of the United States. And the more that students can see that, and the more that teachers and professional educators can see that, they can begin to see that the institution is flawed, but that the institution can be changed as well.
The problem with courses like ethnic studies is that they're taught just like the problem is that they're taught as if it's just another class to pass. That's the problem. Any course like ethnic studies, African American literature, African American history, if it's taught separate from separate from community, it will not have an impact. Because what's happening, we just want the kids to understand, what are the facts, the figures, who were involved. You pass the test, you go. But if it's not connected to a study of community, as tightly aligned to that local community, then it will not have the impact that it's intended, which is the problem that we're having right now. We have kids who are in these courses that are related to that, under that area, but they really don't understand their community. And I'll say this, Gentry High School is in Indianola School District, soon to become the Sunflower County Consolidated School District. Gentry High School was built in 1952. The original structure still stands. When you walk in the lobby of Gentry High School, if you'll miss it if you don't pay attention to it, looking to the left above the planter, you'll see a placard that says South Sunflower County Colored School District. Some of the folk who graduated from the school did not know the placard was there. They didn't know it. When I got to the district as a conservator, it was covered up. And I took it down. And we launched that summer an African American history focus with juniors and seniors in Indianola and at Ruleville Central with Kellogg funds to help the kids connect to their community. But most courses no longer connect to community, so kids are graduating without a clear understanding of their roots, of their history, and what they have to do in order to add value to their own communities.
All right, and panel, keep working on your assignment now to give Bob Moses some suggestions for actions because we're winding down. All right, I saw you earlier, and I'd like to get some geographic room here. I'll take you, young lady. If we have a chance, I'll come back to you on the last round over there. Coming to you next. Go ahead. Yes, sir.
For the Rob Gang. I am from one of the two cities that's vying for ground zero in the reform movement. I am an elementary school principal in the great city of Chicago.
The District of Secretary Arnie Duncan.
That's right. When they closed 50 of our schools, those who haven't heard that yet. They've underfunded our schools for reform. I watched the trailer for the Freedom Summit and ended with this quote that said, if we break Mississippi, we break the South. And I thought, man, what if we substitute the word Mississippi for Chicago and substitute South for this reform? And if we break Chicago or New Orleans or both, can we break this reform movement? And what would that look like? You know, it's the 3.5 years since the Emanuel administration is beginning, and people are really upset. Even principals have been quiet for 3 years, scared for their job. Even principals have begun to speak out against any of the reforms. They've come together, they've put together a platform for what reform is supposed to look like, what the most successful school systems in the world has done, and how what Chicago is doing is the exact opposite of all of it.
And what's your question, Mr. Principal? And we thank you for speaking up.
2 questions. The first one is, if you substitute the words, Chicago in that first quote, what might that look like? So the implication is that this national focus on Chicago, like there was this national focus on Mississippi, what might that look like, and what might steps 1, 2, and 3 of that focus be? And whether there's a national focus or not, what might steps 1, 2, and 3 of just be like just for folks in Chicago?
All right. As I interpret the question, Renard, he's asking if you break the charterization of schools in New Orleans, what's next? And is it going to be any better?
Well, I think that there's several things that need to happen. The first thing is that we need to stop privatizing schools and really find out and see what works and what doesn't work. Because right now, we are just privatizing them. They are making money. They are failing our kids. And we need to stop that immediately.
But you still haven't told us what will come next if you close it down tomorrow.
Let me finish, right?
We're running close on time.
I think the other thing is that we need to look at how we assess student performance. And are we going to put all our eggs in the standardized tests? And the gentleman is exactly right. All of the countries that are doing better than us don't use standardized testing. Right. So we are doing just the opposite of that.
Everybody looks to the Scandinavian model as in the top 10 of achievement, and the United States has dropped down into the early teens right now, or middle teens. All right, the next person I recognize over, yes, the lady. All right.
And I was glad to hear you say that about the educational system, because even though the system was segregated, we produced 2 university college presidents, Dr. Joyce Ladner, who we heard this morning, and Dr. Walter Baptist, who was the president of Morehouse. So we had a great educational system in Hattiesburg. And I think it's about because of the teachers who were at the forefront of the
So all right. Well, thank you very much. Let me take you real quickly. That's all on this side, because we're out of time. Hurry up, Bob. Hurry up now. She wants to give you an award. Capture it on paper. Bob's so modest, he doesn't even want to receive no acclaim. All right. Yes, sir. Quickly, right now. Your question, sir. Standing up. Yes. I know what you mean.
My name is Greg Jones, and I've just spent the last 4 years teaching in Taiwan. So when we look at other countries for best practices, maybe take that with like a pound of salt, because there's a lot of things that we would not necessarily want to copy about some of those other countries. The question I wanted to ask the people on board was back to the statement that was made before, and maybe it sounds too philosophical, but what do we mean by education? What do we mean by education? What if we're going to have a goal for which we're going to assess and come up with methods, then we have to have some sort of conception of where that goal is. And one of the panelists suggested community building. Okay, great, that's good. Would other panelists like to give us their one sentence on what we mentioned?
Right. I want to start off with you, Dr. Watkins, because Common Core does attempt to define what is education. Tell the audience what it means.
First of all, there's no way to say it in one sentence because it's such a complex matter. But if we're going to improve the education of our children, we first have to define what we want them to know and be able to do,
right,
other than just the recitation of facts. And until we are clear about that, nothing else will line up. And so we're hitting and missing because we're not really clear about what we want children to know and be able to do. And we're not clear about the resources that we need to provide children because we're not providing funding, we're not providing quality teachers, and we put in these accountability measures just to ding schools on things that they don't even control, like the quality of teachers, because no college is producing them. We cannot find enough certified teachers right now. And I'll just make this one last point about Gentry High School. This year, we looked at the number of years that the teachers in Gentry High School right now spent in the building, not their numbers of years of teaching in their teaching experience, just the number of years they have been in Gentry High School. On average, 2 years. In the English department, 1 year. So you tell me, how can I sustain the quality of education for my children at Gentry when I can't keep teachers?
All right.
So until we design a system that allows us to do that, we will never be able to define a quality education for our children.
All right. I take 2 more over here, and that's it. I'm turning to my panel, give that recommendation, and then it's going to be 4 o'clock. So I'll recognize one right here in the back, and I recognize you up here in the front, and that'll be it. Yes, ma'am. You all the way in the back, yeah, yes.
Hi, I'm Jenna from Phoenix, Arizona. And I was wondering, because of the education reform is about the role of law in protecting desegregation and equal school finance, do you think that law is the answer anymore? And if not, what are the other resources?
The person asked the question, what is the role of law today in ensuring equal educational opportunities? And quick, I teach my students there have basically been 3 fundamental movements for quality education under the law. One was Brown and desegregation. The second was equal financing, that the state has the obligation to provide education. It funds part of education along with local property taxes, but it gave everybody the same amount, whether you had a lot of money in your school district due to high real estate values, or you had not much money due to, for example, Jackson, you got so many government buildings and nonprofits, and you have such a high social services rate. And the third one that was mentioned too by Dr. Watkins in terms of Mississippi, actually it's a good thing Mississippi has it, and that's known adequacy of funding. And it created this funding formula called the Mississippi Adequacy Education Plan that just never funds it. And you can throw in a few with English language learners, children with disabilities, and the verdict is still out what No Child Left Behind means to education as well as Common Core. But I would say that yes, there's still the tool of the law in complement with people's movement, with public policy advocacy, and with some direct action. All right, one more up here, and then I'll turn to my panelists to go down quickly and give Bob the recommendations for future action. Yes, sir, what's your name?
Mostly Pittsburgh. Our goal is to get more kids into college and into better schools, universities, colleges. Why haven't civil rights organizations attacked legacy?
Attack what? Legacy? Ah, you made my day as the author of a chapter in a book about legacy preferences, mainly for the select schools, particularly the Ivies, but a few public schools too. I'll tell you something that sounds inconsistent. I'm often asked as an advocate to have colleges eliminate legacy preference, that special treatment, that affirmative action, those points that are given to mainly children of alums, particularly whose parents were alums. Sometimes it goes down to grandparents who were alums. Sometimes it goes over to aunt and uncles who were alums. And when asked, do I favor eliminating it, I say no. And they say, well, if you're against legacy preferences, is pointing out to a contradiction for those who oppose race-sensitive affirmative action. Why do you say that? And the answer is because it always serves as such a symbol of the contradiction, that if you are against special race and gender and other sensitive admissions in order to create an equal playing field and provide broader diverse representation for the educational advantages of diversity, then how can you nevertheless support these legacy preferences, which are based solely on genealogy and family and background history and has nothing to do with your merits in school? And so it's always good to have that contradiction for the public debate. But you're right. We have gone after, in some instances, particularly Harvard's legacy preference, but the U.S. Department of Education and the Office for Civil Rights shoved it under the rug. All right. Now, I'm coming down the list. Going back to you in this order, Dr. John, what would you give as the closing recommendation for educational action in the 21st century?
2 solutions. We're here to commemorate Freedom Summer and look at what happened in Freedom Summer critically. Look at the organization of young people. Freedom Summer was about young people, college students and students even younger. Why are we not looking at young people today? So continue to look at young people. Second, the question about law. 49 and 50 states except Hawaii, because they do have an equally funded system, just that they're funded different from all the other states. Every state has what's called a Robin Hood funding case, suing the state in order to get equal funding for schools. These are legal strategies that are already being organized. People are organizing around them. This is the beginning of a legal road to get quality education as a constitutional right.
Thank you very much. Dr. Brown.
I certainly would agree with everything you just said and add that this question of what is education and what do we want, it's an ongoing defining that people will do. It is not being led down that path that there is a right answer and a strategy or multiple strategies. Various communities will have to try on and see what works for them, but people have to understand their obligation to be a part of that conversation. We are not talking about STEM, we're talking about STEAM. We are saying that while we must be prepared for the 21st century and beyond, which means an automatic grasping of the math and the computer skills and whatever. We cannot leave out the arts and the humanistic approach as well. And so, we got to be more encompassing of whole person education. And while there's no one kind of definition we can throw out today, we know it says that all of these parts of the human condition matter.
All right. Thank you. Dr. Sanders.
I think the first thing is that we need to understand in this country that you cannot have excellent schools without having equity. and one does not exist without the other. So we can't take a few schools and take the brightest kids and separate kids by race and class and think that it's wonderful. The next thing is we have to stop the privatization. Public education is for the public good, and we also need to deal with all of those things that the research tells us that causes kids not doing well in school. Not enough pre-K programs in poor communities, not enough extracurricular activities. It's the poverty that we have, and that seems to cross across all race lines and everything. And so we need to just follow what the best practices are and not continue down this road of test, punish, privatize, make money, and disenfranchise poor people in America.
And lastly, but not least, Dr. Watkins.
Full funding, full funding, full funding.
All right, follow the money, follow the money. Let's give our panel applause.